What if I told you that one of history's most powerful empires destroyed itself not through war or revolution, but through a fatal obsession? The Habsburg Dynasty ruled half of Europe for centuries. The Spanish branch controlled vast territories across the Americas and Asia, from 1516 to 1700, while their Austrian cousins dominated Central Europe. Together, they commanded an empire where the sun never set. Yet they engineered their own downfall through one simple practice: marrying their own family members. By the 1600s, their inbreeding coefficient exceeded even brother-sister levels, reaching over 0.25 for their final king. Today, we're exploring how royal inbreeding created a genetic nightmare that brought down an empire. But what convinced the most powerful family in Europe that such marriages were not just acceptable, but absolutely necessary? To understand this madness, we need to step into the minds of the Habsburg rulers. Their marriages weren't about love. They weren't even about politics in the normal sense. These unions served one purpose: maintaining what they believed was divine bloodline purity that separated royals from ordinary humans. Picture the Habsburg court in the late 1400s. Magnificent palaces filled with gold and marble, servants bowing before men and women who truly believed their blood was different from everyone else's. The Habsburgs didn't see themselves as regular people who happened to wear crowns. They viewed themselves as living vessels of God's power on earth. Their blood wasn't just royal blood. It was divine blood, inherited directly from God, through generations of what they called careful breeding. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Habsburgs convinced themselves that God himself demanded these family unions. Some theologians privately rationalized that shared royal blood was a mark of divine favor, though no official church doctrine endorsed these unions. They claimed that mixing Habsburg blood with common bloodlines would dilute God's power. It would weaken the divine connection that gave them the right to rule millions of people. The religious justification ran deep into Habsburg identity. They believed their ancestors had been chosen by God to rule over lesser humans. Each generation inherited not just titles and territories, but actual divine essence flowing through their veins. To marry outside the family meant contaminating this sacred inheritance. It meant betraying God's plan for their bloodline. Refusing these marriages wasn't just politically dangerous, it was spiritually damning. This wasn't limited to distant cousins meeting at family gatherings. Habsburg family trees looked more like ladders than trees. Brothers married sisters regularly. Uncles wed their nieces without shame. First cousins were considered practically strangers in Habsburg marriage planning. Inbreeding studies show even first cousins amplify genetic defects by nearly 18%. The family kept detailed records of bloodline purity, tracking which marriages would produce the most concentrated divine blood in their children. Young Habsburg children grew up knowing their marriage partners had already been chosen from within their own family circle. Take the future Charles II of Spain, whose parents were uncle and niece. These children had no escape from a system that treated them like prize livestock being bred for purity. The political pressure made resistance impossible. Habsburg territories stretched across Europe, from Spain to Austria to the Netherlands. Each region needed a Habsburg ruler with the purest possible bloodline to maintain legitimacy. Marrying outside the family could trigger succession crises, rebellions, or foreign invasions. The dynasty's survival depended on keeping their blood concentrated within an ever-shrinking pool of relatives. But by the early 1500s, something was going wrong with their perfect bloodline. Habsburg children began showing subtle signs that their parents tried to ignore. Some babies took longer to walk than normal infants. Others had difficulty speaking clearly or seemed slower to learn basic skills. Court physicians whispered privately about strange physical traits appearing in the newest generation. The divine blood that was supposed to make them superior was starting to show cracks. The Habsburgs doubled down on their breeding strategy. Instead of recognizing these warning signs, they concluded they needed even purer bloodlines. They arranged marriages between relatives, who were already closely related from multiple previous family unions. Each new marriage increased the concentration of Habsburg genes, while eliminating genetic diversity that might have saved them from disaster. By 1500, the Habsburgs had created something unprecedented in European history, the most inbred royal family the continent had ever seen. Their mean kinship coefficient reached levels higher than typical first-cousin marriages. They had systematically eliminated genetic diversity from their bloodline over several generations. What they thought was divine perfection was actually a genetic nightmare waiting to unfold. The irony was perfect and terrifying. In their quest to maintain divine purity, the Habsburgs had trapped themselves in a biological prison. Their children and grandchildren would pay the price for generations of family marriages. The same bloodline obsession that built their empire would become the weapon that destroyed it from within. The religious justification that had started this practice now made it impossible to stop. Admitting that Habsburg blood wasn't divinely perfect would undermine their right to rule. Acknowledging that family marriages were causing problems would destroy the theological foundation of their authority. They were trapped by their own mythology about divine bloodline purity. As the 1500s progressed, each new generation of Habsburg children showed more severe problems than their parents. What had started as subtle developmental delays was evolving into obvious physical deformities. The dynasty was about to discover that their sacred bloodline carried something far more dangerous than divine power. The first Habsburg children born from these sacred unions should have been perfect. Instead, they were walking warnings of what was to come. Picture the royal nurseries of the early 1500s. Gold cribs lined with silk, wet nurses chosen from the finest families, everything designed to showcase the perfection of divine bloodline. But behind the ceremony and celebration, Habsburg infants were showing signs that something had gone terribly wrong. The earliest generation of heavily inbred Habsburg children displayed subtle but disturbing physical traits that court officials tried desperately to ignore. Court physicians privately recorded speech delays and jaw protrusion, foreshadowing the Habsburg jaw that would define later generations. Some children couldn't hold their heads up properly until they were nearly a year old. Others struggled with enlarged tongues that made even basic communication difficult. Palace physicians noticed these children had drooping eyelids that gave them a sleepy, vacant appearance even when awake. The contrast between public image and private reality became a carefully orchestrated lie. When Habsburg children appeared in public, teams of servants worked to present them at their best angles. Artists painted flattering portraits that minimized physical problems. Meanwhile, private medical records told a completely different story. Court physicians documented growing lists of deformities and health problems that seemed to multiply with each new birth. Royal physicians were sworn to absolute secrecy about these conditions. They signed oaths, pledging their lives to protect Habsburg family medical information. Anyone who leaked details about royal health problems faced immediate execution. This created an elaborate system of cover-ups designed to hide the truth from the public. The medical horror would later be revealed in documents like the post-mortem examination of Charles II, where physicians discovered he had virtually no blood in his body and a heart the size of a peppercorn. These early warning signs were dismissed or explained away as temporary conditions that would improve with age. Habsburg parents convinced themselves that enlarged tongues would shrink as children grew older. They believed drooping eyelids would correct themselves through proper nutrition and exercise. Court physicians, afraid to contradict their royal employers, supported these delusions with fake medical theories about childhood development. The pattern wasn't unique to the Habsburgs. Across Europe, royal families were discovering the dangers of cousin marriage. Queen Victoria's descendants would later spread hemophilia through multiple royal bloodlines, proving that recessive genetic diseases thrived in the closed marriage circles of European nobility. The Habsburgs were simply the most extreme example of what happened when royal families prioritized bloodline purity over genetic health. Some Habsburg children were simply hidden away entirely when their deformities became too obvious to conceal in public. Secret wings of royal palaces housed children who couldn't be shown to visiting diplomats or foreign dignitaries. These hidden princes and princesses lived isolated lives, cared for by small groups of sworn servants who never spoke about their existence. They grew up knowing they were royal, but also knowing they were too damaged to ever rule. The pattern became clear, as each generation produced worse problems than the last. Parents who had struggled with speech difficulties gave birth to children who couldn't speak at all. Habsburg rulers with minor jaw problems produced offspring with jaws so deformed they couldn't eat normal food. What had started as subtle developmental delays evolved into obvious physical disabilities that affected every aspect of daily life. Court records from the mid-1500s show growing panic among Habsburg advisors about the health of royal heirs. Some infants died within days of birth from complications related to their deformities. Others survived but required constant medical care just to perform basic functions like eating and breathing. The dynasty that prided itself on divine perfection was producing children who seemed cursed rather than blessed. The accelerating spiral of genetic damage created succession crises across Habsburg territories. Healthy heirs, who could effectively rule, became increasingly rare. Some Habsburg children were mentally capable, but too physically deformed to appear in public. Others looked relatively normal, but suffered from severe mental disabilities that made governing impossible. The careful breeding program designed to concentrate divine blood was instead concentrating genetic disasters. Within just 3 generations, Habsburg infants were being born with deformities, so severe they shocked even the physicians who had sworn to treat them. The divine bloodline had become a genetic nightmare that was literally destroying the family from within. But among all the problems plaguing Habsburg children, one trait was beginning to dominate their faces in ways that would make their genetic collapse impossible to hide. By the 1600s, the protruding mandible became so pronounced court painters could no longer mask it. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just an unusual appearance. It was a visible sign of genetic collapse that affected their ability to rule massive territories across Europe. This deformity made eating, speaking, and even breathing difficult for Habsburg rulers, creating practical problems for governing an empire that stretched from Spain to Austria. Picture a Habsburg ruler trying to address his court. His lower jaw jutted forward so far that closing his mouth became nearly impossible. When he tried to speak, words came out slurred and difficult to understand. Foreign ambassadors struggled to follow his meaning during important diplomatic meetings. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically dangerous for a dynasty that depended on projecting strength and authority. Physicians noted mandibular prognathism in 66 court portraits, confirming the link between inbreeding and facial deformity, according to research published in the Annals of Human Biology. The jaw problem worsened dramatically with each generation. Parents with mild jaw issues produced children whose deformities were impossible to hide. Some Habsburgs could barely close their mouths at all, leaving them with permanently open expressions that made them look simple-minded. Contemporary portraits from this period show the shocking progression of the deformity. Early Habsburg rulers display subtle jaw problems that careful artists could minimize. But by the 1600s, court painters couldn't hide the obvious genetic damage. Royal portraits show rulers with grotesquely protruding lower jaws that dominated their entire faces. These images were supposed to project power and authority. Instead, they advertised genetic weakness to anyone who saw them. This visible deformity eroded the dynasty's aura of divine perfection, making Habsburg rulers objects of ridicule in rival courts. Foreign diplomats wrote letters home describing Habsburg rulers as looking like fish or dogs. Court jesters in rival kingdoms performed comedy routines, imitating the Habsburg jaw and speech problems. What had once been the most respected royal bloodline in Europe became the subject of jokes and ridicule. Diplomatic authority crumbled when foreign powers couldn't take Habsburg representatives seriously. The psychological impact on Habsburg rulers was devastating. They knew their appearance marked them as products of an inbred bloodline. Mirrors became enemies that reflected their genetic shame back at them every day. Some rulers avoided public appearances entirely, governing through written orders because they were too embarrassed to show their faces. Others became reclusive and paranoid, convinced that everyone was laughing at their deformities behind their backs. But the jaw deformity was connected to other hidden genetic problems that were even more dangerous. Mental instability ran through the Habsburg bloodline, alongside the physical deformities. Many rulers showed signs of severe depression, paranoia, and other mental health problems that made rational decision-making impossible. Their compromised immune systems left them vulnerable to diseases that killed them at young ages, creating constant succession crises. Infertility became another devastating consequence of Habsburg inbreeding. Rulers with severe jaw deformities often couldn't produce healthy children, even when they managed to find wives willing to marry them. The bloodline that had obsessed over genetic purity was slowly going extinct because their concentrated genes made reproduction increasingly difficult. Each generation produced fewer viable heirs than the previous one. Habsburg enemies began using their physical deformities as propaganda against their right to rule. Pamphlets circulated throughout Europe, showing exaggerated drawings of Habsburg jaw deformities. Political opponents argued that rulers who looked so obviously defective couldn't possibly be chosen by God to govern normal people. The divine right of kings became a joke when the kings themselves looked like genetic disasters. Religious leaders who had once supported Habsburg marriages began questioning whether these deformities were signs of God's displeasure. If the Habsburg bloodline was truly divine, why were their children being born with such obvious defects? Some priests suggested that the family's marriage practices were sinful and that God was punishing them through their offspring's deformities. The theological foundation that had justified centuries of inbreeding started cracking under the weight of obvious genetic failure. Military commanders questioned orders from rulers who looked and sounded mentally impaired. Tax collectors struggled to enforce policies when the royal authority behind them appeared weak and defective. Common people began wondering why they should obey kings who seemed less capable than ordinary citizens. The visible genetic damage was undermining the entire foundation of Habsburg political power. These physical problems were creating serious political crises that threatened the empire's stability. Succession became a nightmare when potential heirs were too deformed or mentally impaired to rule effectively. Foreign territories began declaring independence rather than accepting obviously defective Habsburg rulers. But all of these problems would pale in comparison to what was coming next. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity was about to produce its most catastrophic failure yet. Charles II of Spain was supposed to be the Habsburg dynasty's crowning achievement. Instead, he became living proof of their genetic nightmare. Born in 1661, Charles represented the final product of centuries of careful inbreeding. His family tree looked like a twisted ladder rather than a branching structure. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, but their relationship was even closer than it appeared. Multiple previous marriages between Habsburg relatives meant Charles's parents shared more genetic material than typical siblings. The numbers tell the horrifying story. Charles II reached F0.25 akin to an incestuous parent-child level of inbreeding. To put this in perspective, children born from brother-sister relationships typically have lower inbreeding coefficients than Charles II. The Habsburg obsession with pure blood had created the most genetically compromised ruler in European history. Charles's daily struggles with basic functions made governing the Spanish Empire nearly impossible. Eating became a nightmare because his enlarged tongue and misaligned jaw prevented normal chewing. Servants had to cut his food into tiny pieces or feed him liquids like a baby. Speaking clearly remained difficult throughout his life. His words came out slurred and mumbled, making royal proclamations sound like the ramblings of someone mentally impaired. Foreign diplomats struggled to understand what their host was trying to communicate during important state meetings. Walking remained a challenge even as an adult. Charles moved with the unsteady gait of someone whose body had never developed properly. His physical weakness was obvious to anyone who saw him. Court ceremonies became awkward displays where the king could barely perform basic royal functions like standing for extended periods or climbing stairs without assistance. The man who was supposed to project imperial power instead looked frail and broken. Medical research suggests Charles suffered from combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis simultaneously. These genetic disorders, caused by his extreme inbreeding, created a cascade of health problems that affected his growth, development, and kidney function. The conditions likely explained his impotence and contributed to his early death at just 38 years old. Court physicians' private assessments painted a picture of a man who was essentially a living corpse, requiring constant medical intervention just to stay alive. Charles's obvious mental disabilities created a power vacuum that others quickly exploited. Court officials made decisions in his name, while he sat silent and confused during meetings. Foreign powers recognized his weakness and began manipulating Spanish policy through advisors, rather than dealing directly with the king. The Spanish Empire continued functioning, but Charles himself contributed almost nothing to its governance. He was a puppet ruler controlled by others, who recognized his complete inability to make rational decisions. Diplomatic envoys scoured Europe for royal brides, but 2 dynastic matches yielded 0 heirs, sealing the dynasty's fate. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans was arranged purely for political reasons. When she died childless, Habsburg advisors frantically arranged his second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Despite years of trying, no children resulted from either union. Charles's genetic problems included severe infertility that made fathering children impossible. The bloodline that had obsessed over genetic purity for centuries was going extinct because their concentrated genes had eliminated the ability to reproduce successfully. Charles showed little interest in his surroundings and maintained a slow, indifferent demeanor that suggested severe mental impairment. He spent most days in a daze, unable to focus on royal duties or even basic conversations. Servants managed his daily routine, like caring for a large child who happened to wear a crown. The divine bloodline had produced a ruler who was divine in name only. European powers began preparing for war long before Charles actually died. Everyone could see that his death without an heir would create a massive succession crisis. The Spanish Empire controlled territories across Europe and the Americas. Multiple nations had claims to different parts of this empire. Charles's obvious inability to produce children meant that centuries of Habsburg control would end with his death. Foreign courts started making military preparations and diplomatic alliances for the inevitable conflict over Spanish inheritance. The final years of Charles's reign became a countdown to dynastic extinction. His health deteriorated steadily as his genetic disorders took their toll. Court officials spent more time planning for his death than following his orders. The Spanish Empire began fragmenting as regional authorities recognized that central control would collapse when Charles died. When Charles finally died in 1700 at age 38, he left behind no children and no direct Habsburg heir to the Spanish throne. The inbreeding that was supposed to concentrate divine power had instead concentrated genetic destruction. European powers had been waiting for this moment, their armies already positioned for what would come next. After Charles II's death in 1701, conflict erupted, culminating in Utrecht in 1713. The moment news of his death reached European capitals, armies began marching. Diplomats rushed between courts, making final preparations for conflict. This wasn't unexpected. Every major power had been planning for this day, since it became clear that Charles would die without children. Picture the war rooms of Europe in late 1700. Maps covered every surface. Generals pointed at Spanish territories that stretched from the Netherlands to Sicily, from the Americas to the Philippines. The Spanish Empire controlled more wealth and territory than any other power on earth. Now it sat like a feast, waiting to be carved up by hungry neighbors. But this wasn't just about grabbing Spanish gold or claiming new lands. The War of Spanish Succession wasn't really about politics or territory alone. It was about preventing the Habsburg genetic legacy from continuing to destabilize Europe. European powers had watched the Habsburg genetic decline for decades. They had seen how inbred rulers created succession crises. They witnessed how genetic problems made effective governance impossible. No one wanted another Charles II ruling any major territory. French King Louis XIV moved first. He declared his grandson Philip would inherit the Spanish throne. This made perfect sense politically. Philip was young, healthy, and came from strong Bourbon bloodlines. More importantly, he wasn't a Habsburg. His genes hadn't been poisoned by centuries of family marriages. Other European powers immediately opposed this plan, but not for the reasons you might expect. England and the Dutch refused any Habsburg heir, citing political and genetic concerns. The Austrian branch still had claims to Spanish territories through Archduke Charles, later Emperor Charles VI, whose inbreeding coefficient reached F0.1287. Alliance leaders worried that allowing any Habsburg to claim Spanish territories would restart the cycle of genetic disasters. They had witnessed how Habsburg genetic problems created succession crises across multiple territories. European powers had been watching Habsburg genetic decline for decades, waiting for the moment when biology would finally overcome politics. Court physicians across Europe shared private medical reports about Habsburg rulers. Diplomats wrote detailed letters describing the physical and mental problems of Habsburg princes and princesses. Everyone knew the bloodline was collapsing. They were just waiting for it to happen. The war's outcome was influenced by genetics as much as politics. No one wanted to risk another genetically compromised Habsburg on any throne. Alliance propaganda didn't focus only on territorial disputes or trade routes. It also emphasized the dangers of allowing diseased bloodlines to continue ruling healthy populations. Pamphlets circulated, showing exaggerated drawings of Habsburg deformities. Political cartoons mocked the jaw problems and mental disabilities that marked inbred rulers. Habsburg genetic problems had created similar succession crises in Austria and other territories, making their entire empire vulnerable. The Austrian branch of the family suffered from the same inbreeding that had destroyed their Spanish cousins. Emperor Leopold I showed obvious signs of genetic damage. His children displayed the familiar Habsburg jaw and associated health problems. Other European powers recognized that Austrian Habsburgs were just as genetically compromised as their Spanish relatives. Regional authorities throughout Habsburg territories began questioning their loyalty to obviously defective rulers. Military commanders wondered why they should follow orders from kings who looked and acted mentally impaired. Tax collectors struggled to enforce policies when royal authority appeared weak and broken. The genetic obsession that had built Habsburg power was now undermining it across multiple fronts. The scientific understanding of heredity was beginning to emerge, making royal inbreeding seem barbaric rather than divine. Natural philosophers started publishing theories about how close breeding damaged animal populations. These ideas quickly spread to discussions about human genetics. Royal inbreeding stopped looking like divine wisdom and started appearing as dangerous ignorance that threatened entire kingdoms. Other royal families began deliberately avoiding Habsburg marriage alliances, treating them as genetically contaminated. French Bourbons refused marriage proposals from Habsburg princes and princesses. English royalty declined diplomatic marriages that would introduce Habsburg genes into their bloodlines. Even minor German princes avoided Habsburg brides who might carry genetic damage to their children. The remaining Habsburg territories were being carved up by healthier, more stable royal bloodlines. Bourbon France claimed Spanish territories in Europe and the Americas. Austrian Habsburgs lost influence in Germany, as other princes switched their allegiances to genetically superior rulers. The Netherlands broke free from Spanish control entirely. Italian territories declared independence rather than accept another compromised Habsburg ruler. The war officially ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. But the real victory belonged to biology over politics. Habsburg genetic obsession had finally consumed the empire it was meant to preserve. Their bloodline continued, but their power was broken forever across Europe. Yet the damage they had inflicted on European royal genetics would prove far more lasting than anyone realized. The web of genetic connections spread far beyond Habsburg territories, creating consequences that would reshape European history for centuries. Strategic marriages designed to build political alliances had unknowingly planted genetic time bombs in bloodlines across the continent. Every major dynasty connected back to Habsburg ancestors through multiple marriage lines. French Bourbons carried Habsburg genes through distant cousins. German princes inherited genetic material from Habsburg great-grandmothers. English royalty traced bloodlines back to Habsburg marriages from generations past. Queen Victoria's hemophilia spread to Russian and Spanish royals, reshaping events like Rasputin's influence over the Romanov court. Victoria herself carried genetic mutations that traced back to Habsburg bloodlines. Her marriage to Prince Albert, her first cousin, created the perfect conditions for spreading hemophilia throughout European royalty. This rare bleeding disorder killed several of her descendants and influenced major political decisions across multiple kingdoms. The genetic legacy of Habsburg inbreeding was still driving European politics centuries after their empire fell. The hemophilia that plagued Victoria's descendants changed the course of European history in ways most people never realized. Russian Tsarina Alexandra passed the condition to her son Alexei, heir to the Russian throne. The boy's constant illness dominated court life and gave enormous influence to the mystic Rasputin, who claimed he could heal the child. This religious fraud gained such power over the royal family that he destabilized the entire Russian government. The genetic damage that had destroyed the Spanish Habsburgs helped create the conditions that led to the Russian Revolution. German Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, suffered from a withered left arm that historians now trace to birth complications caused by inherited genetic problems. His physical disability created psychological issues that influenced his aggressive foreign policy decisions. The same genetic damage that had twisted Habsburg jaws was now shaping the mind of the German leader who would help trigger World War I. Biology was still driving European politics centuries after the Habsburg Empire fell. The scientific revolution finally explained what the Habsburgs had done to themselves, making their practices seem not just dangerous, but completely insane. Natural philosophers began publishing detailed studies about animal breeding that revealed the dangers of mating closely related individuals. These findings quickly spread to discussions of human genetics. Royal marriage practices that had once seemed divinely inspired now appeared as ignorant superstitions that violated basic natural laws. Medical advances allowed doctors to understand the connection between family marriages and genetic disorders. Physicians could explain why Habsburg children had suffered from similar deformities generation after generation. They understood that concentrated bloodlines increased the chances of inheriting harmful traits from both parents. This scientific knowledge made Habsburg marriage practices seem not just unwise, but actively harmful toward their own children. Modern genetic analysis has revealed the full extent of Habsburg inbreeding damage, confirming historical accounts of their genetic catastrophe. Scientists studying Habsburg remains found inbreeding coefficients that exceeded even the worst historical estimates. DNA analysis proved that Charles II was more inbred than children born from brother-sister relationships. The scientific evidence validated every horrible description of Habsburg genetic problems written by shocked court observers centuries earlier. The Habsburg case became a cautionary tale that helped end the practice of royal inbreeding across Europe. Other royal families studied the Habsburg genetic disaster and changed their marriage practices to avoid similar outcomes. Close cousin marriages became rare among European nobility. Royal families began deliberately seeking marriage partners from distant bloodlines to introduce genetic diversity back into their families. Educational institutions began teaching the Habsburg story as an example of how political decisions could have devastating biological consequences. Medical schools used Habsburg genetic problems as case studies for understanding inherited disorders. The dynasty that had once been Europe's most powerful became a teaching tool for explaining why certain marriage practices were dangerous and should be avoided. Today, Habsburg cases form classic studies in genetic counseling, demonstrating the importance of diversity and underpinning modern screening practices. Scientists studying the Habsburg family tree have identified specific genetic mechanisms that cause the problems associated with close breeding. This research has helped develop treatments for genetic disorders that affect ordinary people whose ancestors practiced similar marriage patterns in isolated communities. The tragic irony was perfect and complete. The bloodline obsession that built Habsburg power became the weapon that destroyed it. Their pursuit of genetic purity created genetic poison that spread through European royalty for centuries after their empire collapsed. The divine blood they had protected so carefully became a curse that influenced European politics and royal bloodlines long after their power ended. Habsburg genetic problems continued shaping European history through World War I, the Russian Revolution, and countless other events influenced by genetically compromised royal families. Their story stands as proof that some forces operate beyond the reach of crowns and empires. The Habsburg obsession with pure bloodline was a betrayal of biology, teaching us today that genetic diversity is essential to any society's health and stability. Their empire collapsed from a deadly mix of politics and genetics, proving that even dynastic power must bow to biology. The very practices intended to preserve their divine status became the weapon that destroyed them from within. Think about this pattern in your own life. How often does the pursuit of perfection through control and isolation create the very destruction it seeks to avoid? Whether in genetics, politics, or personal relationships, the same dangerous cycle repeats when we refuse to accept that some boundaries should never be crossed. If you found this journey through royal genetics eye-opening, share your thoughts on history's most twisted dynasties below.